climate change doesn't live on an island. We're all impacted by it.
It's really not and shouldn't be a political issue.
Climate One has ensured that indeed many, many different parties have seats at the table.
Every mainstream religion has a mandate to care for creation. We all have a moral responsibility to the future, the way parents have a responsibility for their children.
We all have children or relatives who are very young. Do we not want their world to be good too? Do we not see clearly that what we are doing is not sustainable? And if you do see that, and you continue to deny it for some political reasons, then this is a travesty.
Kids are growing up now, and there's absolutely no question on whether climate change is real, whether climate change is happening, and the question now instead is, what should we do about it?
The future of environmental activism is motivating young people to become civically engaged.
Now more than ever, we need to come together as a culture and a society to address this really important issue.
I am a supreme optimist. I do believe that we can transform ourselves. I do believe that we have the energy, ability, and courage somewhere inside of all of us to do what has to be done.
Thanks for joining us for this live stream conversation with Anna and Frances Moore Lappé. Frances is author of Diet for a Small Planet, published 50 years ago this year. Anna Lappé is author of Diet for a Hot Planet, The Climate Crisis at the End of Your Fork. Together, they're co-founders of the Small Planet Institute. We're recording today's conversation for the Climate One radio show and podcast that drops every Friday. You can subscribe wherever you get your pods. You can submit your question for today in the comment section of the live stream. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, we all are, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ohlone and Miwok people who inhabited these lands for 10,000 years. So please welcome Anna and Frances. It's delightful to have you on Climate One. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, it's really great to be here.
Frances, your aha moment occurred when you were 26 years old and a graduate student at Berkeley. Headlines were telling us running out of food. What did you realize in that seminal moment?
Well, the first shock was to realize that this scarcity scare message that was being proliferating everywhere, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, had exploded, and everyone was terrified that we were literally running out of capacity to feed ourselves.
I'm sorry, Frances, just 1 second. I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just move your boom down a tiny bit? Yeah. There you go. Sorry for that interruption, but yep.
That's fine.
So Paul Ehrlich was, yes.
Yeah, it was scaring us all, but it was that sense of desperation. And young women were saying, I can't have children because we're overrunning the earth. It would not be right for me. And I thought, if I could just understand why is there hunger in the world? If I could just tackle that key question of food, that would unlock the mysteries of economics and politics, and I'd figure out a path for my life. So fortunately, I had access to one of the best agricultural libraries, the University of California at Berkeley, and I went in with my dad's slide rule. Probably most of our viewers don't even know what that is today, but I still have my dad's. And I literally started putting two and two together with the help of friendly librarians. And the big aha was, wait a minute, we are actively creating scarcity, the experience of scarcity that is, for millions and millions of people. There is no absolute scarcity. There is plenty of potential for us all to eat well. And I just had to tell the world. So Greg, I wrote a one-page handout, and I thought it was such great news that actually, because we're creating it, we humans, we can end it. And I thought people would just say, yeah, right, how do we do that? And so that was the beginning for me, but it was to realize that our whole system was so incredibly wasteful, and that there was abundance if we would reorganize so that everyone who was hungry had access to what potential there is. So I could go on and on about those ahas, but that was the first.
What was your diet like when you were growing up?
Well,
Frances?
let me tell you, I grew up in Cowtown. Literally, it was called Cowtown. And I could almost smell the stockyards from where I lived, right? It was Fort Worth, Texas. And what was a meal without meat? It did not exist. So I grew up in that culture of just presumption that the center of the plate was a big slab of some kind of meat. And so it was kind of shocking to the girl from Cowtown saying, wait a minute, cows are a big problem. Of course, I didn't know how big a problem they were then. But it was really that sense of we are creating the experience of scarcity out of plenty that was the calling for the rest of my life. Like, why would this bright species create the world that none of us as individuals would ever choose? Because no one chooses to force others to go hungry or to degrade the earth. So that's been the leading question of my life. Why are we creating a world together that as individuals we abhor? So that's kept me going for 77 years. Well, not since then, but for a good 50 years since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet. Yep.
And Diet for a Small Planet changed the eating habits of generations, and we'll get into that with Anna. You know, did it change your parents' habits or any of those people back in Cowtown?
I can't say it was made a huge change, although for my parents' generation, although they were very supportive of me, I just found the copy that I inscribed to them. They were very supportive. But I did feel that I was part of a culture that was saying, yes, yes, yes. It was that moment where we were questioning so much, you know, coming out of the 60s, where we felt like we could make progress on civil rights. We could make progress on political rights. And so I felt really supported. And in Berkeley at that time, you know, there was a lot going on. I love it that Alice Waters' Open Chez Panisse, the very month that Diet for a Small Planet was published. And there was just a lot of back to the land energy, you know, that we can go back to the land and grow our food. And I felt like I was really part of that awakening to our relationship to the earth has to be rethought, and it can be abundant for all if we restructure.
And we'll get into some things you didn't realize at that time when climate was not really part of the conversation. But when you wrote Diet for a Small Planet, you had never heard of agroforestry. What is agroforestry and why do you find it so exciting?
Well, growing up in Texas, driving around, you know, outside on the way to Oklahoma to camp, all you saw were big fields of monoculture of feed grains. And it never occurred to me that trees and crops could be friends and actually help each other. And, you know, that was the opposite of my sense of agriculture. And it was really, I don't know, when I first got captivated by this, I was working on a book on world hunger more than a decade ago. And I just was entranced with one of the poorest countries in the entire world is Niger. And there, after colonialism had, you know, led to a lot of tree cutting, that at the end of colonialism there, the farmers started remembering and reviving their traditional practices, which had included the mixing of trees and crops. And it turns out that in that very warm climate of limited rainfall, that actually trees help the plants grow, help the crops grow, because it helps to shade the soil, so evaporation doesn't happen as fast. It provides fodder, you know, for livestock, but also leaves that can be used as part of the, you know, the fertilization of the soil and enriching it. So there was a whole shift then away from a monoculture toward the interweaving of trees and forests, and millions of trees were then reestablished, those that had been cut, because it turns out if you just leave a stump alone and you know, it has little sprouts coming out, it will reestablish itself. And so that transformation then is spreading south as well into other areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And I was just so moved by it because it was building on the best of traditional practice and building on a knowledge base that was really farmer led. It was called Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration is the you know, acronym, which I love. So to really emphasize that it's farmers who are creating this synergy.
Anna, what are some of your earliest memories around food and growing up as the daughter of a woman from Cowtown?
Well, I'm sort of like, the fish that lives in water. You don't know anything else. But, I definitely was raised, if any listeners or viewers read Diet for a Small Planet, yes, I was raised on the walnut cheddar loaf and on all of those recipes in there. The book came out a couple years before I was born. But to be honest, my most vivid memories of my childhood, well, I would say they're as much in the kitchen as they were in the streets. When I was young, my mother had just co-founded the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and a lot of their work was actually about, yes, about diets and changing diets, but also about foreign policy. And at the time we were living in San Francisco, there was a lot of organizing around Central American solidarity. And so I have vivid memories of marching in the streets, and probably my most vivid childhood memory, earliest one, was actually traveling with my mother and my older brother to Guatemala, where she was there to learn Spanish, but also about land reform. And I have this absolutely like photographic memory of this moment of sitting atop this hill of this town where we were living at the time, where she was studying Spanish and researching agricultural reforms there, and looking out and being able to see with the child's eyes so visibly the inequality in front of us. So this large landowner that had all this land, and then all of these small homes, stacked close together, and asking my brother and I these questions about, why is that? Why is there some people that have so much and some people that have so little? And so I would say, I always like to say, growing up with my mother, yes, like she cared about what was on our plate, but she also cared about what was happening outside in the world, and getting us as young people to be asking those big questions.
Any bouts of teen rebellion where you wanted to go against your mom's political views? Seem so, these sort of, I'm just impressed, amazed by this kind of, relationship and alignment.
Yes. Well, maybe this is true confession time, that my parents separated when I was quite young. So I had this whole other household, which was my father's, and he was an incredible activist in his own right, and epidemiologist and toxicologist, in many ways shared my mother's politics, did not share her culinary practices. So I did have exposure to Captain Crunch and Fruit Loops and pork chops and applesauce. And in a way, it was great, because it did give me this exposure to a very different way of eating, and allowed me as a young person to then actively choose, when I set out on college and set out on my own, to choose the very Diet for a Small Planet, plant-centered, as we like to call it, planet-centered diet.
Okay, so you are human. You've eaten Oreos. Okay, got it. And like your mom, your aha moment also happened when you were 26 and read a book about globalization. What was that, and what insight did that open up for you?
Yeah, so it's a pretty remarkable story for the two of us, that, as you said, one of my biggest aha moments was the same age my mother was, 26. I was in graduate school at the time, studying economic and political development, trying to figure out my life's path. And I had a really clear idea what my mother should do, which was to go back to those original insights of Diet for a Small Planet, which were fundamentally, as she talks about all the time, that we have to talk about the intersections between democracy and power and food and hunger. And I suggested that she help people gain a sense of possibility by seeking out the stories of people and places around the world that were really bringing that kind of living democracy, as she likes to call it, to life. So were there places where you actually saw city governments getting to the root causes of hunger, and social movements actually addressing that kind of power imbalance that I saw as a young person in Guatemala? And at the time, I was doing all the reading I could before we set out on a journey that eventually would take us to Brazil and India and Bangladesh and Kenya. And one of the books I read was Thomas Friedman's The Lexus and the Olive Tree, about globalization. And when he talked about Brazil, where we ended up traveling to, he said there's no organized resistance to a very neoliberal model, to a system of kind of industrialization. And yet, when we arrived in Brazil, we were there to learn about the landless workers movement, which was and is one of the largest social movements in this hemisphere. And we got to see with our own eyes people bringing practices like agroforestry to life, and bringing sustainable practices to farming, and really proposing that there were other ways to organize economies and societies. And my aha moment then was twofold. One, to realize there are these incredible social movements happening, not just in Brazil, but around the world, showing us a different way that we can farm, that we can organize societies. And my second aha was that here I was sort of trusting this expert in Thomas Friedman who missed this story, who wasn't talking about this story. And I actually wrote him an email at the time and said, hey, when I was in Brazil, not only were we researching this vibrant social movement that you didn't mention in your work, but you couldn't pick up a newspaper without hearing about it. There was a leading member of this social movement was like a character in the most popular telenovela at the time. And to his credit, Thomas Friedman wrote me back and said, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing. I'd never heard of them before. And the fact that you could have such blinders on and that he literally couldn't see the story was my other aha, and made me realize that so much of the work that needs to happen is the showcasing of these stories. And that's what we ended up writing together in our book, Hope's Edge. And that's been, I think, one of the things I've always loved about my mother's work is, yes, it's about analyzing what's wrong, but it's about telling the stories of the solutions that abound around the world.
So the woman at an Ivy League school learns that elites don't have all the answers, right? Yeah.
Yeah, big surprise there.
Frances, I'm interested, because so much of the movement that you're part of, is perceived in some circles to be elite, coastal, privileged, white people who can afford certain kinds of food. But it's always for you been informed by the people you've met around the world. So disabuse us of that myth that sort of, organic food is kind of a, Prius driving people in Berkeley and Boulder, et cetera.
Well, I've already mentioned the people in Africa, in Niger, who are among the poorest in the world, who showed me a whole new pathway and are succeeding brilliantly. And another opportunity I've had, and that I'm so blessed to have had, is that I got to visit in rural India a group of women. They're called the Deccan Development Society, that embody, I think, the answer to your question, because they're just one of many, many villages now. But they, 25 years ago or so, they told me that everyone in the village suffered from hunger, and that they felt very oppressed and really had no power vis-a-vis of either husbands or other authorities. But then they realized that if they began to meet every week, after their kids were in bed, they began to meet, and they developed this little micro loan system to begin to have some assets that they could think about actually renting and buying some land that was unused nearby. And they were going to do it a different way. It wasn't going to be just monoculture rice. It was going to be the whole range of crops. And they walked me out into one of their fields with 20 different species growing in an acre or so. And these were all foods that were good for them. They were legumes, they were greens, they were also grains too, but very intense intentionality to what they were growing in terms of health. And they told me now there is no hunger in their village. And I've been following them. And one of the things that most impressed me, well, they got their own radio station. So they wanted to spread the word. They spread this approach to at least 75 villages, but they also, I learned recently that the state government is now procuring for school lunches their healthier millets, since replacing the white rice that the kids had been eating. And so they are one example to me. And I have to tell you this moment that will stay with me forever. As I was leaving the village of the Deccan Development Society women, and by the way, they are the lowest caste. They are often seen as completely powerless, the Dalit caste, terrible system. So I was walking out of the village, and suddenly I heard voices behind me, and I turned, and there were the women rushing toward me, waving, "No, we forgot to tell you the most important thing." And I stopped, of course, and they said, "We forgot to tell you the most important thing is that through our women's group, we found our courage." And courage, Greg, has been right at the heart of every book I've written since, and most shorter pieces, that ultimately it depends. What is courage? It is the capacity to break free from your reference group, people who are judging you, and to find your own voice and power. And they embody it to me. They just broke all the norms and created something so healthy that is now being replicated, and they've been invited around the world to share their story. So I think that's the kind of thing that we have to understand, that we can learn these powerful lessons that will give us courage to address the tight concentration of power in our own society here in the US.
Right, and a lot of your work focuses on concentration and power in corporations and government, pretty much anywhere. You say there's a trilogy of conditions you think that lead to healthy systems and balance of power. What are those?
Yes, well, this is the definition of what Anna said, is my living democracy definition. But let me say, before I give you those three, I want to tell you what they serve. And that is that I've come to see that human beings have three needs beyond the physical. They are a need to sense that we have voice, we have agency, right? We have need for meaning in our lives, not just surviving, but real meaning. And we have need to do, discover, and advance together. So it's power, meaning, connection are essential human needs. But there is only one structure of public decision making that can possibly meet those human needs. And that is what I call living democracy, characterized by the widest dispersion of power, because we know concentrated power leads to terrible things. So the widest dispersion of power. The second, holding that power accountable, is transparency. We need to know what's going on. Most recently, I just read the Washington Post review of how much we did not know, how much information was twisted and held from us in terms of the history of our involvement in Afghanistan, just to pick one example. So transparency is key to democracy. And the third condition, and this is really hard, this is a cultural norm that we need to cultivate. And that is a norm of mutual accountability, I call it. It's the opposite of blame, 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 which is easy, unfortunately, for humans to fall into. They did it, I didn't do it, no. It's the idea, I think of it like this: if we're all connected, which we are, then we're all implicated in whatever happens, whether it's, we can blame the military industrial complex and our political system for denying us facts, say, about the day from Afghanistan to the dangers of GMOs.
Or climate change. Yeah, from climate change.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. We can blame, 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 or we can say yes, as Abraham Joshua Heschel, rabbi, has said, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And I love that. Yes, we have to name those who should be held accountable, hold them accountable. Some should be criminally charged, but all of us are on the hook for not stepping up sooner, allowing that to happen, and for solutions now. So I just love that. And the way I say it too is that we're all connected, we're all implicated, and therefore we all are part of the solution.
Well, Anna, what are the implications of industrial agriculture, which is concentrated power, for democracy and food justice?
Yeah, well, the implications, we're seeing it every day. The implications is an incredible stranglehold on the decision makers who are supposed to be serving the public interest. My mother and I were just looking at the latest figures from opensecrets.org about how many lobbyists there are for agribusiness and how much they're spending. And in just 2020 alone, agribusiness spent $140 million that year alone to lobby on behalf of their interests. And that's actually, they had about 1,100 lobbyists, 60% of whom were former government employees. So this kind of revolving door, as people talk about, between government and industry. And so what has really only increased in these last 50 years is a consolidation of industry. So you have just a few corporations controlling much of the meat packing in this country, just a few controlling much of the food retailing. And as a result, you have this kind of influence on government regulations that's creating a kind of food environment that makes it really hard for farmers to transition off of pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that are so bad for the climate. That makes it hard for everyday people to access the kinds of really nourishing, nutrient-dense whole foods that we should all be eating. And so, it's really important that we understand that in order to change our food environment, we need to really work to get money out of politics, and we really need to work on how to take on that kind of consolidated power in the industry.
Well, Frances, Moore Lappé, with alarm bells ringing so loud on the climate emergency, is democracy up to the task? Is it fast enough?
Not the democracy as we experience it here in the United States. This is the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? I mean, we aren't stepping up yet. So I couldn't stress more that we all need to know that we can sort of, what is the metaphor? Chew gum and walk at the same time. We can be democracy advocates and climate change activists, and we have to make clear that connection, always in our hearts. Make clear that connection, because we're not doing it, and we rank just to motivate. You know, I've looked at where we score relative to other democracies and the quality of our democracy, and we are literally behind dozens of other countries. And so we can't succeed with this level of exactly what Anna was just talking about, where money has so much power within our system. And that wasn't true as much at all when I wrote Diet for Small Planet. I just want to point out, during the 1970s, there were not these armies of lobbyists in Washington. That started coming with the Reagan years and after. But the number of lobbyists, I think, increased 14-fold in the decade after, I wrote Diet for a Small Planet. So we know we can do better. We know we can do much better. And so it's the joining hands, the democracy movement and the climate movement joining hands.
And speaking of hands, I know you're speaking with your hands sometimes. I just want to be careful of the microphone if you can.
Oh, thank
Frances,
you. It's hard. I have to
I know. Yeah.
I'm such a...
No, don't sit on your hands, but just, yeah.
We joke that if she had to have her hands tied when she was speaking, nothing would come out. She loves to use her hands.
Well, you've certainly inspired a generation of people. We have listeners watching the live stream. Ellen says, your book inspired me to become a vegetarian 40 years ago, still going strong, vegetarian even during pregnancy and a healthy baby. And Lisa said you convinced her to become a vegetarian. You must come across this a lot. And Stephen and others have been saying, since she was 13 years old, lifelong vegetarian. So Frances, it must be quite gratifying to see changing lives like that. And yet also you've seen the lives go in a positive, what you would say is a positive direction, but the system seemed to have gone in a different direction. How do you live with that contradiction or duality?
I live with it with a lot of tension. But I want to underscore, and I so appreciate those comments. I can't tell you that enough. But I do think, despite the fact that we haven't gone nearly where I had hoped we would be yet, that I do think still that food has special power. Because we can't buy a new solar panel every day, but we can choose what we put into our mouths every day. And it ties us, we know, to each other, to the earth, to the climate. And so I think it has a sense of, as we align those daily choices with the world that we want, we feel more powerful, we feel more confident. And I hope you who made these nice comments about the book would agree with me that often people say to me, thank you, Frankie, I became a vegetarian, but just as often or more often, I went on a different path than I would have otherwise. And that's what I love about really understanding the issue, particularly climate change now, through the food lens, because it's something that's so personal and we make those choices every day. And everybody likes to talk about food too. So it's a good gambit to talk about climate around the table when you're with people who never, aren't focused on climate. So I'm just a big fan of using this entry point, which is food and agriculture.
And speaking about the climate emergency, Frances, it's so urgent that we need to act quickly and globally. And I want to challenge you a little bit on the notion that concentrated and big is always bad. Large corporations can act on global scale. Organic food is still only about 1% of American cropland, but the industry is tens of billions of dollars. But is big always bad? Sometimes some people would look to, Walmart getting into sustainability practices, organics, et cetera, that has real power. Is that bad power?
Well, I'd like Anna to weigh in on this too, but my answer to that is that it's not about scale, it's about who's in control. And that's why the democracy piece of it, if we have to crawl and beg, a corporation answering to shareholders and not to the broad public, that's really ties our hands. And so we need democracy answering to us so that we can put the standards, place the standards on all of our interaction with the earth, and guidelines and sources that of funding that are going toward the farmers who've already proven that they can farm ecologically. So I really want to emphasize that it really is fundamentally about who's answering to whom. Are we, the public and public interest, setting the standards, enforcing those standards, answering to the long-term viability of life on Earth? And right now, private corporations, they may be doing it for some motive, but it's not that public motive.
And Anna, there are some industrial organic producers that are quite huge, right?
Yeah. Well, I just want to add on to how my mom began to answer that question, which was about that question of in whose interest are these companies acting, and how do we scale up in the public interest? And I think one of the most powerful ways to do that is to tap into the power of governments that, again, are supposed to be working on behalf of the public good. And there's so much potential power. And a lot of climate activists are talking about the power of procurement, they call it. So the government is purchasing a lot of energy, but guess what? Also a lot of food. And so one of the ways that a lot of the folks that I work with across the US, but also around the world, are exploring to really change systems quickly. We know we need to move fast around climate. We know we need to move fast around biodiversity collapse and its ties to overuse of pesticides. One of the things we can tap into is the fact that state governments are spending billions on food every year. And can we use those dollars and move it into the public interest? One policy that colleagues of mine have been working on adapting and adopting and exploring around the country is called the Good Food Purchasing Program. And it's a model policy used by now school districts, a number of them across the country, to say, if we, a public entity, is going to be buying food, let's bring our values into it. Let's not just choose the cheapest. Let's think about climate. Let's think about health. Let's think about the local economy. Let's think about workers. And in so doing, we're seeing really exciting supply chain changes at scale. And that, to me, is really an exciting example of how we can operate and make change fast.
Right, and college students are pushing for that kind of change as well on college campuses, which are often serviced by very large corporations. Anna, what are some of the biggest myths about how we eat and the system that produces our food? You're into myth busting.
Well, I think one of the biggest myths is that the food that we see out there was somehow created out of consumer demand. And in Diet for a Small Planet, my mom has this chapter I've always loved called Who Asked for Fruit Loops? And, it's like, did any parent ever say, you know what I would love? I would love a company to create a product that's irresistible to my children and delivers to them more sugar than they should be eating for an entire day. No parent asked for that. Smart marketers developed it, right? And product designers. And so, I think it's about looking at how do we actually, again, have a food environment that is serving the public interest, not just, helping a few companies gain huge amounts of profit.
We're talking today at Climate One with Frances Moore Lappé, author of Diet for a Small Planet, out first 50 years ago today, and her daughter Anna Lappé, author of Diet for a Hot Planet, The Climate Crisis at the End of Year 4. Together, they're co-founders of the Small Planet Institute. Frances, I want to ask you about, why nitrogen is important and why it's not talked about more in the climate conversation. Nitrous oxide is often overlooked.
Well, there's nitrous oxide, and then there's the nitrogen overload in general. And nitrous oxide is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And so that is, and it's throughout our industrial ag system is relying on it. And so that's a real hazard. And then the nitrogen that leaches into our waterways. I have talked about this in in the new chapter of Diet for a Small Planet, because it's been so missed, that nitrogen runoff then goes down through the system out into the Gulf of Mexico in the US and creates a dead zone there that is, I believe, as large as the state that I live in, Massachusetts. So there is just this incredible negative loop here all the way around that just is so unnecessary when we can create ecological systems so that you have organisms that are generating the nitrogen that plants need. And that is what agroecology is all about, where it's really working with the soil organisms to nourish the plants. So I think that nitrogen, nitrous oxide are two aspects that are really underestimated in the damage that is being done. How that we're killing ourselves to feed ourselves. That not a good deal. That we do not need this.
And in 2006, there was a seminal report from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization called Livestock's Long Shadow. It was the first time scientists parsed out the climate impacts of cattle. What impact did that have on you in the broader climate conversation?
Yeah, so that report was what set me on the path to write Diet for a Hot Planet, because in that report, as you said, scientists looked at for the first time what do we know about livestock's impact, both from indirectly and directly in terms of their environmental and climate costs. So looking at the amount of land being used to grow feed crops, the role of livestock grazing and feed crop production in terms of deforestation. And at the time, what the researchers found is that livestock production alone, again, directly and indirectly, was responsible at the time for about 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which at the time was more than all planes, trains, and automobiles combined. And if you think about that moment, that was right around the same time that An Inconvenient Truth came out and the climate conversation was taking off. And yet I read this report, and then I was reading the climate conversation, and I realized people were not putting food and food systems more broadly into that conversation. Keep in mind that, of course, we don't just eat meat and dairy. When we talk about livestock, that's just one piece of the food systems. Shortly after that report came out, other researchers tried to look at overall how much food was responsible for the climate crisis and estimated about 1/3 of all emissions. A new report came out more recently estimating about the same, about 37%. So huge, huge impact on climate. And I ended up writing Diet for a Hot Planet because I wanted to understand, why was this not being talked about? Why were climate advocates not looking at food systems change? And why were folks working on food systems change not realizing how much their work connected to climate? And one of the things that came out of that research that was so edifying for me was to learn that in addressing the damage that food systems do on climate, in looking at how can we shift them to ways of growing food that actually reduce the climate load, that actually at the very same time, those solutions are going to make farms more resilient to climate shocks. In other words, they're going to make soil more absorbent, more able to handle drought periods and flooding events. That it's going to push farmers and support farmers in moving toward growing a more diverse set of crops, which is good for our health as well as resiliency, so that there were all of these co-benefits too. And that was so exciting to realize that, yes, we can think of food systems as part of the casualty of this crisis, right? That farmers are on the front lines, that they're a huge cause of the crisis, but also they really are, farmers and folks working on food systems, a key part of our solutions to get us out of this climate catastrophe.
Frances, you write that cows pack such a punch that if they were a nation, cow country would rank as the world's 6th worst greenhouse gas emitter. But if food waste were a country, it would rank still higher as 3rd worst. Is that getting as much tension as you would like?
Yeah, no, it is not. And I really feel strongly that just that statistic that you just cited is such a wake up for people. I don't think we've realized that. And also in terms of waste, how central that is in addressing the climate crisis as well. So how do we deal with that more healthfully? And that's a huge, huge question in and of itself. And so I'm really glad that we're now awakening to the food ag connection that Anna has so laid out in Diet for a Hot Planet. Yeah.
And if eating animals is so bad for the health of humans and the planet, why are you so critical of meat made from plants by companies such as Impossible, Beyond Meat? Isn't displacing meat a good thing?
Great question, Greg. And I would say in your question and how you asked that question is fundamentally my question about these alternative meat products, which is, are they actually displacing meat and dairy consumption? So you're talking about this huge new market for products that might look and taste like meat, but that are plant-based. And one of the arguments that I hear from investors into this space and to proponents of this whole new line of products is, hey, we're going to create these products and we're going to see a decrease in meat and dairy consumption as a result. And I will be really curious to see if that plays out. What I am seeing and hearing from the companies that are moving into the space, some of which are the biggest meat companies in the world. So Tyson Foods, for instance, just bought up some small alternative meat, plant-based meat companies. And in their pitch to investors and analysts, they said, they want to be really clear. This is both and. They are both growing their desire for expanding their market share in their meat lines, and they are growing these plant-based products. And so my concern would be, let's be really clear-eyed. Are these products actually decreasing our consumption of meat and dairy? And I would say, really, the way we're going to make the kind of rapid shift away from the overconsumption of meat and dairy in just a handful of countries that are really seriously overconsuming meat and dairy is going to come from policy changes and regulation changes that are going to make really the polluters pay, make the companies that are essentially getting subsidized to produce meat and dairy that's highly industrialized, not good for the environment, not good for our bodies. That's how we're going to see really rapid change. And while it's great, I have no problem with having more choice in the marketplace for consumers. I think, as you know, Greg, knowing we need to move so fast on these triple crises around the climate, public health and nutrition and biodiversity, we really need to be trying to put all of our energy toward growing more healthy whole foods, not more ultra processed foods, whether that's ultra processed meat or ultra processed meat-like products.
Right. And I wanted to unpack a little bit that message from large meat industry packing companies. Is it'd be very difficult for them to say, we're creating this new plant-based meat. And by the way, we're going to put all the cattle ranchers out of business that we depend on for now. That would be kind of a very difficult, almost suicidal thing for a company to say, hey, cattle ranchers who supply us with the beef we need, we're going to put you out of business. So stay in business until we put you out of it. Right.
Well, what you're hinting at there, too, is this whole framework around a just transition. Right. How do we ensure that the folks that are working in industries that we know we need to sunset? I mean, coal, for instance, is an example of one. I would say the folks that are working in the fracked gas industry, there's a number of industries that we know we need to sunset in order to meet our climate goals of not sending us off a climate cliff. And we absolutely need to be thinking about how do we create good jobs and jobs that are not going to hurt the workers who are employed in them. And I would argue, you look at meatpacking, it's one of the most exploitive and injury-prone jobs in the economy. Let's make sure that those people who stay in meatpacking have good jobs that pay a decent wage, and those who are transitioning out have access to good jobs that also pay a decent wage.
Frances, you and your daughter are stridently opposed to GMOs because they shift power away from farmers to large corporations, and they enable industrial monoculture and more pesticides. But not all GMOs are the same. For example, people living with diabetes in this country rely on insulin that is made from genetic engineering. Insulin made from cows and pigs is not even available commercially in the US. So can you accept that some GMOs have productive uses, such as insulin?
Yes, that's certainly not my emphasis. Is not GMOs per se. It is that the GMOs that are prevalent in our agricultural system are engineered to work only with a very, very dangerous pesticide, one that has been banned or been seriously limited in many industrial countries. And because the power of the corporate makers, it has that hasn't happened here. So I really want to focus not on the genetic
technology itself, but how it's used.
Absolutely how it's used, and how little testing, how little, and even what was tested, just how unclear the results were. I mean, introduced and spread so widely without any consciousness and public accountability. And I just, Anna's father wrote one of the first exposés on glyphosate. And I just felt this power of Monsanto at the time, and in its undue power, because it tried to get that book to press and failed. But we as a family have a personal taste of what happens when concentrated power is determined to keep going in a direction that we now know, our pesticide overuse in this country has just been extraordinary. I believe I had here in 30 years globally an 81% increase in pesticide use, and that is clearly part of the great danger in industrial ag. I call it corporate chemical ag, by the way.
And Anna, if biotechnology can make a difference in slowing down the climate crisis, would you embrace some technology? I heard your mom say that it's not the technology, it's the power and how it's used.
Yeah. No, and that's a question over the 20 years I've been writing about this that I often get. And I guess the way I keep answering it, because nothing much has changed in 20 years, is I like to look at, well, what is the technology that we have seen come out in agriculture? So you mentioned some other genetic engineering technologies in pharmaceuticals, but, let's really look at what actually, not, some potential promise of how these technologies might be used in the future. And what we've seen over the decades since the mid-1990s that we've had genetically engineered seeds is this technology has only been able to be very narrowly deployed in really just basically one of two ways mostly, either engineered to resist a proprietary weed killer or engineered to express an insecticide. And those are the technologies and the properties we've seen. And I remember when I was working on Diet for a Hot Planet, I wanted to explore this question from the climate perspective, because we were hearing, could genetic engineering help us, for instance, create drought-resistant crops or flood-resistant crops? Yep. And I said, I want to go into this question really open-minded. I'm not, I don't have a preconceived answer to that question. Let's see what the science tells us. And researcher after researcher I talked to said, look, Anna, the complexity of the genetics of seeds is such that that kind of engineering for a complex quality like drought resistance or flood resilience is not possible with the kind of genetic engineering that we have. That yes, you can engineer to resist a toxic chemical like dicamba or 2,4-D, but that kind of resiliency built into seeds is not something you can get through that technology. And instead what they shared with me, and we've seen this now the past decade even more, that through ecological innovation and breeding through ecological practices and agroecology, that you are seeing farmers able to save and share seeds that are highly resilient, highly adaptive to climate. And I've seen it with my own eyes, farmers that have been able to withstand incredible extreme events because they have seeds that have adapted to the environment. So, I think I still keep an open mind, and yet I don't want us to fall into that trap of let's keep believing these promises of some technology that will exist in the future when we actually can see with our own eyes really proven impacts of ecological practices for farmers around the world.
Right, something like small modular nuclear reactors, it's always seemed to be 10 years away, the promise of a different kind of nuclear.
Frances, and we don't have time, and we don't have time to kind of keep holding out hope these promises will deliver.
Frances, around the time that you wrote Diet for a Small Planet, there was the famous crying Indian advertisement that people of a certain generation will certainly remember, probably before Anna's time. But that really was an iconic advertisement that placed responsibility for litter back on individuals. And it was put backed by the American beverage industry, people making the cans that were thrown out the window. And I bring this up because your focus and success has really been on changing individual action. And there's a kind of a rethinking happening in the climate conversation now that putting the onus on individual lets systems and corporations and suppliers off the hook. And so I'd like to get your reflection on, whether individual choices like eating less beef, does it, matters for personal health, but do you really change a system that way?
Well, I want to push back a little bit, because my insight from the beginning was that, because this is what happened to me, that as I said, oh, food, it's so basic, and I can make different choices, and I don't have to buy into this rotten system that not only was so wasteful, but then I learned was polluting and heating the planet. So I think that our psyche is built so that if we can feel that we matter, that our choices matter, then our goals heighten and we feel more connected and we pay more attention and we want to connect with big solutions. So I guess I see this personal choice as a way that I don't feel so much a victim. I feel more powerful. I then exude more sense of I can do this, and other people pick up on that, and that we show by our very lives that these myths are really myths, that are the myth that we need all this protein and animal food. And so we're defying that. I just feel like it's not an either or, Greg. It's really all about empowerment. And the more that we can align our individual choices with the world we want, then the more powerful we feel, and the more we then, radiate out, because we're all social creatures and we take our cues from each other. And we see somebody who's feeling more empowered and they feel healthier besides, then I want some of that. That's the instinct to go for. So, so it's the both and, that by individual choices, we can take on the big public choices, because clearly the rules have to change.
Sometimes us media people fall into the trap of false binary questions. And thank you for calling me on that. Plus, I think you also, at least I feel better eating nutritious food rather than Fruit Loops. So there's that part too.
Yes.
Clearly, Frances, your work has been intergenerational, and there's a number of generations that have come on, including your daughter. Anna, I'm interested in how having a daughter changed your outlook, now the third generation of Lappé food activists.
Yeah, we got a few more Lappé activists coming up too, and my granddaughters. Well, it's been life-changing. I can say that. It's been one of the most special things in my entire life, that it was just like the universe opened this door, that just as I was starting a new path, as Anna was graduating from grad school, and we could travel the world together. Imagine that, traveling with your child, and to interview and to be right there face to face in the field with social movement leaders around the world. I mean, and we were both so changed by that, because we heard these stories, like Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Greenbelt movement. We got to actually sit in her guest house with her and her friends, and we heard these incredible lessons about courage, because she faced obstacle after obstacle. And I'll never forget, I said, well, Wangari, how did you do this? She said, I just kept walking. And then she smiled and said, but sometimes you have to jump. And so that means leap into the unknown, right? So I guess for me, I also have a son who's doing amazing things too. But Anna and I together have just had that fortunate to have that life-changing moment, as she started the interview today, how that impacted her when she was just coming out of grad school. And equally for me, it was life-changing to work with her.
And you've given a TED talk about how that came with some pressure and expectation you had to work through in your life, big shadows.
Yeah, I mean, some interviewer at one point when we worked on the book together asked me about, what's it like to live in your mother's shadow? And without realizing this was a very cheesy answer, I said, I'm not in her shadow, I'm in her light. And then as somebody who really likes to cut the cheese out, I was like, that's maybe borderline. But no, I think for me, one of the one of the things that I've reflected on in working with my mother is how fundamental the need to work across generations is to the kinds of changes we need to make. You know, I think a theme of our conversation today is both the urgency of the crises we face, but also how big they are. And I don't expect that I am going to, you know, somehow fix any of the things I'm working on in my lifetime. And so I feel this incredible sense of lineage, not just to my, you know, my mother, but to so many other activists and you know, across generations. And really tapping into that, I think, is so important to all the movements that are trying to make change today, to really know that that kind of intergenerational wisdom is so critical.
Anna, as we wrap up here, get toward the end, you talked earlier about you know, agribusiness lobbyists. You know, Tom Vilsack, current U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, in many ways embodies that. Was in the Obama administration, then worked for industry. Now he's back in charge of the Secretary as Secretary of Agriculture. Now that he's in that position again, how do you evaluate his policies on climate and the food connection?
Yeah, well, you know, I will be honest, and probably will not come as a surprise that he was not my first choice for what you're describing, right? He left the USDA, went as to lobby for the dairy industry, came back into the USDA. And yet what we are seeing in this Vilsack administration is so far really an incredibly different set of policies coming out. And I credit that to grassroots organizing across the country that has really changed the politics and changed what's happening in DC. So in the past 10 years, you've had the emergence of networks like the Heal Food Alliance. It stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor Alliance. So a network of grassroots movement organizations across the country that have actually put pressure on the Biden administration. Groups like the National Black Food Justice Alliance, incredible organization. So what I'm seeing come out of the Vilsack administration, to me, is a reflection not of this one person having like a paradigm shift, but of how politics works. That when you organize and make your voices heard, you see change. And so just recently, we just saw the Biden administration announce, for the first time, I think since the 1970s, a reassessment of how much money a family who is on food stamps, what's known as SNAP, needs in order to feed themselves, and increased that budget by 25%, because finally you've had an administration that listened to advocates saying families are not getting what they need to feed themselves. We're seeing the administration look at things like the rampant racism across the USDA and look at how can they support Black farmers and other farmers that have been discriminated against by the administration historically. So we're seeing changes. We're also seeing industry influence. There was a recent administration proposal to look at a kind of a new climate soil act. One of its biggest co-sponsors was the agribusiness bear that is pushing this policy because they think it will be a boon for its herbicides. You know, do I think that is the direction we should be moving? No, but I am seeing some openings in the administration that show to me that, again, organizing work, speaking up, putting yourself into the fight makes a difference.
If you search climate smart agriculture, at least I did, and the first thing that came up was an ad for Bayer, which owns Monsanto. It shows how they're perhaps co-opting those terms. Frances, the last question, you know, did you ever imagine that a plant-centered diet would be as widespread as it is today? And is it finally becoming mainstream enough to make a difference?
Yes. I just read recently that more and more people are choosing plant-centered eating. And certainly we now know that if we, for example,
did we just lose her?
We just lost her at the last moment. So how about that for a dramatic ending? Maybe she will know to log back on. But Anna, since you're her technician, I think that's probably not the case. We'll wrap it up there. We've been talking about the 50th anniversary of Diet for a Small Planet with Frances Moore Lappé and her daughter Anna Lappé, author of Diet for a Hot Planet, The Climate Crisis at the End of Your Fork. Together, they're co-founders of the Small Planet Institute. I'd like to give a shout out to the Climate One team making this happen. Adam, Arnav, Mariana, Kelly, Steve, and Tyler. On Climate One, we've been talking about food and more today. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcast. Talking about climate can be awkward and depressing and difficult. It also can be interesting and exciting, as you've seen today. So please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review.
Sorry, we almost made it without a tech error, but do you want to just come in and say your goodbye, Mom?
Sure.
Shut the door. Thanks again, Greg.
Thank you. Anna, please, we'll keep Zayan. Yes. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.